Hey guys, today I'm back in Polybridge and I want to try making a car with a working transmission. Now there aren't any great ways to make gears, so I'm going to need to find another way to make some sort of speed selector. So let's get right into it. Now starting out in the sandbox here, the first thing I did was put down a custom shape and I set it to be a motor. Now I can't use the custom shape to power the car, but it's a really easy way to test out some different linkages. So I just set that up here, and after I did that, I set the motor strength to be as strong as I could and the target velocity to be 100. And you see the result here is that it rotates and seems to work pretty well. Now with that done, I put a static anchor right below it, and I ended up putting down a wheel. Now I just used 4 cables to attach it up to the motor, and you can see here, rotates as well. Now to start working on the exciting part, I put in a second wheel that's a little bit bigger than the first one. And it's centered on the same joint as the small wheel, but it's not attached to it in any way. And to attach them together, I want to use some linkages like this. Now the plan is that as it rotates around, the linkages will get closer together, and when they do that, they'll impart more force on the large wheel than when they do when they're spread further apart. This means that they're going to be pushing harder on one point of the rotation than the other, and they should rotate the wheel around. And you actually do see that here. It starts to rotate it mostly in one direction, though it's very inconsistent motion, and it comes back as well. Now I put down a road here just to see how it would do under load, and it's not very good. It just seems to swing back and forth randomly, and it's really hard to tell if it's doing anything. So I just went ahead and completely maxed out the number of linkages I could put on this, and once I did that, in this final test here, it seemed to be as bad as it ever was. It was pretty much not moving from the bottom, and adding in all these extra linkages seemed to just balance the mechanism. But if I get rid of the road, the motion looks pretty good here, but since it doesn't work under load, this is really going to be useless for a transmission. So I ended up deleting all this because I had another idea instead. What I wanted to try using was a bistable mechanism. Now I need a straight line linkage in order to do this, and I built one up here. And given it a test here, I've shown this one off a few times before, but you can see this point is traveling straight on a line, and that is going to work really well for me here. Now I ended up using a smaller form of this linkage, and you can see it still works pretty well here. And I ended up deleting a larger portion of the wheel, putting the straight line linkage right next to it. And I used one link to connect it to the wheel, and you can see here, it actually moves up and down pretty well. Now it's close to what I want, but I ended up refining it here, and you can see how it goes up, down, and then sort of dwells in the middle for a while. And that should work really well for the bistable mechanism. So to make this mechanism, what I needed here was a spring and a piece of steel. And my original thought was if I compress the spring in the middle, the steel can only snap to one side or the other side, and those are the 2 states it can be in. Now, if I connect it up to linkage using 2 arms like this, the original plan was to pull this linkage up and down into place, but instead I realized there's a much better way to do this. As this swings back and forth, I'll be able to have it snap one way or the other, and that'll be my bistable mechanism instead. But I got rid of the spring and I replaced it with a piece of steel, and it made it a lot more rigid to the point where it was really snapping side to side. Now everything's at 100% stress when it comes down, which isn't great, but it should work since I'm planning on using unbreakable mode anyway. And I ended up setting up a chain of steel just to work as sort of a transmission, also test out how it would do under load. And at first it seemed to be pretty good. After I got it all hooked up like this, I put down a long arm, and it really was starting to struggle with this. It was still working, but when it comes down, it sort of hesitates before it snaps around. And when I add in a road, it just gives up. It can't move it at all, and this linkage, while it works better than the first one, still just isn't strong enough to make it work. Now I thought about this a little bit more, and that's when I ended up discovering the anti-parallelogram. Now this is kind of interesting. You'll see here I just have these 2 bars that cross into each other. When I let this swing back and forth, you'll notice that the bottom joint is going a lot faster than either of these middle ones. And the interesting thing about the anti-parallelogram is that it sort of has a reverse motion to it. So if I have it in this setup here, you notice that the one arm rotates in the opposite direction of the opposing one. And just by bracing it slightly differently, instead of having a reversal, I ended up getting sort of a 2x rotation to it. So I want to try to use this to work as sort of a rotation doubler and make my transmission out of this. Now it seemed to be moving pretty fast at first, and I didn't really like how it was snapping around this bottom joint, so I decided to make it a little bit more square, and I was thinking maybe the more solid shape would help it out, but now this bottom joint seems to be moving way too fast, and pulling it in was actually the wrong choice here. So I ended up extending it out, and after I did that, I bisected every single one of the joints. Now the purpose in doing this is to reinforce it so that once it fully collapses in on itself, it doesn't want to just totally break. Now once I bisected all of the joints together, I have to connect it up like this. I just had to make sure to reinforce everything again, and with that done, gave it a test here, and it seemed to work just as well as before, except this time it's impossible for it to break. So I decided now I might as well hook it up to the wheel and see how that drives it. So gave it a run here, and it started to pull it up just fine, and it actually did not seem too bad. But the one thing I didn't like about it was at the very bottom of the rotation, the output seemed to rotate a lot faster than at the start. Even with that though, it was still rotating 2 times as fast, and under load, this actually should be able to support itself. Now I noticed that at the very top and bottom parts of the rotation, it was a little weak, and I think part of it may have had to do with the way I braced the mechanism together, so I wanted to change my original method out for one that's a little bit better. Basically, the idea of this one is instead of just having one contraparallelogram, I'll have 2 and I'll have a regular parallelogram mechanism so that at any point, either one of the contraparallelograms is fully working and it should support it together pretty well. And the support seemed good here, but the way I was getting driven by the motor wasn't very good, so I had to add in another linkage here, and once that was in place, I gave it a test and it seemed to work just fine. Now, I still didn't love how at the very bottom of the rotation is moving faster than the top, and I ended up extracting out the rotating piece to make it a little more obvious what I'm talking about. And the way I hooked up with cables isn't that great, but it does show how at one point it rotates a lot faster and then it slows down for the second part of the rotation. And I really don't want this. I want one continuous rotation the entire time, and that should give me the best power transfer to the wheels. So I ended up building off of this mechanism, and I wanted to just try out a few different anti-parallelograms to see what was the best way to do this. Now I ended up figuring out that this point ends up being a pinch point here, so as it rotates around it, it has to rotate a lot faster. So if I move the pinch points further away, it tends to give me a much more continuous rotation. So I ended up building up the same mechanism, but I used much longer arms this time, and now it seemed to be performing a lot better. So once again, it was a little hard to see the output rotating, so I ended up using another set of 4-bar linkages, and I extended it out, and you can see here, this piece in the middle is rotating twice as fast as this piece, and it's pretty consistent. Now to make it even more clear, I wanted to hook it up to a second wheel like this, and it actually seemed to be working pretty well. And one of the best parts of this mechanism is that right now I'm actually driving it using this wheel, and the output is this wheel. So I'm able to both half and double my rotation using this mechanism. Now to hopefully improve it a little bit, I ended up just doubling it up and flipping it on the other side, and this doesn't make it rotate differently at all. All it's gonna do is reinforce the mechanism a bit more and also balance it so that it doesn't want to fall to one side or the other due to gravity. So I stacked another one of these mechanisms on top of everything, and I just wanted to see if I could drive it in a big line, and it actually did seem to be working. So right now, this wheel is rotating 4 times as fast as this one, and my plan is to hook up an engine to the middle wheel so they'll both have a half and a doubling effect, and I'll be able to select between 3 different speeds. Now to make the actual selector between these 3 speeds, what I'm doing here is adding in a rotating wheel, and I'm adding in some hydraulics, and the plan is if I use some cables like this, ordinarily it's going to be completely taut and that bottom part's going to have to rotate. But if these hydraulics expand out, the wheels are going to be completely loose, and then it's going to rotate however it wants. That means I'll be able to disengage each one of the wheels or engage it at any time, and that'll allow me to drive the wheels however I want. So I added in a bunch more hydraulic phases, and after I did that, I hooked up 2 more sets of hydraulics, and these connect to the 2 other wheels. Now I started out just by testing the middle one, and it seemed to be working just fine, so I extended it out to the big one as well, and I also made the rotation go out to this other wheel just so that's not obscured by the hydraulics, and it does seem to be working. I can select between all 3 of the gears, and it seems to transfer to the big wheel just fine. Now I was curious to see how it would do under load, and adding on some roads here, it seems to be just fine. All of them are able to take this load, which is really good. That means all of them should be able to drive the car. Now I ended up deleting all of the static joints here, and I started out actually building up the car. Now to do that, I need to build up a frame, and I'm just using some steel for that. Once I had all the important parts linked together, the next thing I wanted to do is create a bit of a base, and I just wanted to have this rest on the ground and be able to spin freely. So I got that all hooked up here, and after I did that, I extended out the land just to make room for this to fall down, and to start out, it actually seemed to be fine, but it was hitting the ground, which wasn't great. So I ended up just raising up a little bit off the ground, and finally after that, seemed to be rotating just fine. So the next step was to get rid of the custom shapes. Now I could have left them in the design, it would have been fine, but getting rid of them just makes it look a little bit better in my opinion. After I did that, seems to rotate just fine still. So the next step is to start working on the wheel. Now I always end up making this mistake, but you can't attach more than 32 bridge pieces to a single joint, and I always forget this, and when I was building up this wheel here, I added in too many spokes, and once I was finishing it up here, I ended up getting that error message, and I had to start over again. Now the reason I want to start making some wheels here is I want to make a fully functioning car. I wasn't exactly sure how well it was going to work going up hills and stuff, but I figured it was worth a shot, and I wanted to make the wheel as round as I possibly could so that it would actually roll nicely. After I had that done, I just had to create some attachment points in the middle to rotate with, and with that, I ended up just trying to attach it up to the body. And I had to move it out a little further than I'd like, but it wasn't too big of a deal. I just attached it up to the frame like this, and in this test, it seems to hold on just fine. So I built off the front of the car, and I wanted to work on the engine. Now, the engine's going to be really important here, and there's really 2 main types to run with. I can either do a glitch-powered engine, or I can do a truck-powered engine, and I wanted to start with the glitch-powered engine since generally it's a little more powerful, and it's a little more consistent. And I've shown off a few times how to make this work, but the idea is I have springs, and if I pull on them with the hydraulics, they get super tensioned, and for whatever reason, the game ends up starting to rotate the structure they're attached to. And you can see here in this test, it gets very glitchy, and it just sort of starts to rotate here. So I made sure to attach it up to the car, and once I did that, it seems to rotate just fine. So I attached this up to that center rotating piece, and I was hoping I'd be able to both double and half the rotation coming out of this, but it seemed to not work too well, and it's because these engines tend to be very high speed and low torque. So I actually attached it up to the very top part of the transmission, so to be able to divide the speed by 2 and by 4. And I was hoping this would work better, but it seems to rotate a little too fast, and this actually causes the whole thing to break. Now, I ended up switching out the cables for some steel pieces. This didn't really help though, and it just seemed to kind of bind up and break. So I decided to get rid of the glitch-powered engine and instead go for the truck-powered engine. This should totally solve my problem since it actually goes slow and it has a lot of torque, so it should work better here. So I put the monster truck down, and after that, I built up another wheel, but this time made the outside of the wheel out of roads. This allows the truck to drive around it and start to spin it around. Now, it's hard to see here, but I'm putting in some springs, and these are going to push down to the truck and force it up against the wheel, so it has to rotate it around. And to make the truck go really fast, what I ended up doing was setting its mass to be kind of low. I gave it a really large amount of horsepower and acceleration, and I capped its speed at about 10 meters per second. This means that it ends up going around this wheel just fine, and if I attach it up here, I should be able to get it to power everything. So I just linked it up to the top of the transmission, and I wanted to give it a test here, and it kind of seemed to be working. Now, once I had it all linked up, I wanted to add in the front wheel, and this is so that I could actually get a consistent test here and see how it would do. And with it all ready to go, it fell on the ground just fine, and it started to rotate up, and it actually seemed to be working here. Everything was rotating pretty well. The car was moving back and forth. I'm not exactly sure why that was happening, but otherwise it seemed to be working just fine. Now, to connect it up to the wheels, now I'm adding in that speed selector that I made before, and once I had that done, it was time to test it out here. It seems to work, but the front wheel's dragging a little bit, and I realized making the front wheels powered would probably just be a better way to go. So I can just directly link it up to the back wheel, and once I did that, it actually seems to rotate pretty well. Now, I decided to make 2 test tracks for this car, and the first one you see here. Now, it starts out with a big ramp in the front, and that's what the low gear is going to be for. Then it switches into the middle gear, and that one goes through this really rocky area. And finally here on this downhill section, I have it go into the largest gear, and that should allow it to go as fast as possible. So I started out now, and the lowest gear is actually really slow. It does work, and it gets up this hill, but it really takes its time doing it. The good thing though is that the car never actually ends up stalling, and it goes pretty well the whole way up. Now finally here at the top hits a checkpoint, and that signals it to switch into the middle gear, and with that it actually switches into the most powerful gear. Now it's a little counterintuitive, but the slowest gear is actually less powerful than the middle one. Even though it goes slower and there should be more torque, because of all the losses in the system, it actually ends up being worse than this middle gear. But with the middle gear end up done here, it goes into the top gear, and this is the one that has the least amount of power, and it's like a fourth the amount of power as the middle gear, and it actually struggles to get up to speed. But with a big hill like this, it ends up doing it reasonably well, and it can really bolt to the end here. Now I liked how that was doing, and that's why I made the second test track here. This one is just a big ramp that goes straight down, and the point of this was to show that the largest gear actually is useful, because I really didn't get enough time to show it before it just ended up hitting the world border. Now to start off, I'm actually going to be using the middle gear, and you'll see here it's a lot slower. So it picks it up just fine, switches into gear just fine, and it starts going down this big hill. Now it looks okay, but it's actually skipping quite a lot as it goes down. At the very bottom, you'll notice it slows down quite a bit. And now zooming in, you'll actually see the wheels aren't even rotating with it moving. It's actually just sort of jumping over the terrain. So I ended up switching the 2 checkpoints, and the second one is going to switch it into the largest gear. Now the truck ends up hitting the checkpoint, and it starts to shift, but I noticed some problems. Basically, it just stops moving, and I was kind of wondering what was going on here. And looking at it a bit closer, it seems like I first need to shift into the middle gear before I go into the large gear. So let's give it a test. See, hits that first checkpoint, then hits the second one, and that seemed to prevent any problems. And this time it is a lot faster. You can see it really starts going down that hill, and as it comes down, it's not skipping at all. The wheel's pretty much continuously on the ground, and that means once it gets to the bottom, it carries that momentum really well, and it really just sails. So guys, thanks for watching. I wanted to make a mechanism like this for a while, and I just thought putting it in a car would make a nice little video. So if there's anything else you want to see, make sure to leave it in the comments down below. Subscribe if you want to see more content like this. Make sure to like the video if you like the build, and otherwise, until next time.